let's have a seat. Fantastic. So, I'm Xinchen with the China Global Television Network. And I flew all the way from China, 12 hours flight, and a lot of my panelists today are also flew in from afar, and I'm going to introduce them for real quick. We have Hussein Kasai, the founder and CEO for Crunch AI. And we also have Professor Erica Kramer Mbula, Professor of Economics from the College of Business of Economics at University of Johannesburg, South Africa. And of course, we have Mr. Anthony O'Sullivan, partner and director at Whiteshield. And last but not least, we have beautiful Maya. I'm trying your last name one more time. Wunia Witch. Close enough. CEO of O Group and living 17 different places and around the world and travel to 78 different countries. And I need to, catch up with you for my travels. But anyways, so yesterday I was doing my interview with all the Saudi ministers or labor authorities here, and the CEO for Takumo said that if we look at today's world, it has been pretty decentralized with all the digital and the information technologies and rising up. People are changing their attitude towards work, and especially we are in a recovery era out of COVID. A lot of the momentums or attitude towards work has changed over the years. Why not let's start with Maya. Speaking of, what do you see like right now with the rise of technologies or other information technologies and flexible contracts, work from home? How has that changed the dynamic in the labor market or how people find a job?
Yeah, good afternoon and salam alaikum. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my second time in Saudi within a month. It's such a pleasure to be and to be listening to a lot of the panelists, so thank you for having us here today. I think you ask a really critical question, particularly in a country such as Saudi too, with a young population. I think it is a broad question. As you've mentioned, I've lived and worked over 17 different places in the world, 5 continents, and we have invested in infrastructure projects as well as some cutting edge things in AI, blockchain, space exploration. And what I see is what I call a schizophrenic market around the world. It's quite a tough market to gauge, I would say, where it's going specifically, because if you look at gig economy and kind of freelance workers, there are positives and there are negatives we'll get into with the rest of the panelists. But I think what I see is United States leading kind of in these freelancers and gig economy, but that's because there is so much protection there in labor laws, right? Mm-hmm. Where in other parts of the world, it's rising as well, but we don't have those protections, right? So again, depending on where you are in the world and what the skills are, right? And what the training that government or private sector provides, that's where you'll see the differences in the gig economy.
And absolutely, and speaking of gig economies, actually, I find it's quite hard to really define what gig economies truly is, but it's really vast, it's large, and based on different individual specialties, it might mean something different to individuals. But what I learned, as you have mentioned, Saudi Arabia has a really healthy population and a really strong younger labor force. But a lot of those younger generations are grown with, in an era of big data, artificial intelligence, etc. I want to point out some numbers. Speaking of like conference calls, which I hate a lot, but Tencent meeting is equivalent in China to Zoom, and right now they have over 400 million users and has been growing on double digits for the past 3 years, even out of COVID pandemic era. And more importantly, it's like people are willing to pay more, to pay the subscription fees to use the conference call system or whatnot. So definitely people are seeking further flexibility, work from home, whatnot. So for Mr. Solomon, so what's your take on this? Technology, work from home, flexible contracts, how are they becoming more important, tailored towards like employees or even employers?
Yes, thank you for the question. So at Whiteshield, we focus on policy for companies and for governments, and one area is labor. And we're doing lots of work with the Ministry of Human Resources today on the future of the gig economy and how it impacts Saudi Arabia. And I would say, generally speaking, we're very gung-ho on this potential of the gig economy. In particular, I think there's a generational gap, it's true. And if you look at trends happening outside of Saudi Arabia, such as, for example, in the United States, almost 50% of the younger generation, so the XY generation, are involved in the gig economy in one way or another. Not necessarily full-time, but involved. So you can imagine that this is a huge potential. And Saudi Arabia right now is about 7% of the workforce, and moving up. So you can look at this one trend. Now, the big opportunities when you talk to people is that there was a recent survey that came out that was done, namely with Stanford University, which highlighted that workers are looking to keep this permanent, this remote working. It changes by culture, which is interesting. So workers are looking for between 25% and 50% of their time in the week to be remote. And actually we see a tension with companies, because companies are actually looking and saying, well, it's a bit the bosses versus the boss, and they're coming and saying, we would like actually workers to remain more and more in the office. And so that is going to be playing out. And companies are having a comparative advantage when they're able to offer to workers these opportunities for flexible and remote work. That's why companies like Visa, for example, and others have defined specific days of the week in which people are working in the office, and the rest of the time they can be remote. So good opportunities and challenges. Probably one of the biggest tensions is on the area of innovation, because on the one hand, technology is allowing innovation because you can have open competitions, for example, access talent all over the world. I think you're a former GE, and Echo Imagination is just an amazing opportunity to develop open innovation and accessing global talent. At the same time, there's namely OpenAI, which has been arguing that you need to have people together in order to foster innovation. This connection, like even this conference here today, which, by the way, is a superb organization by Takamul to make this happen, really wonderful setups, lots of connections happening. And that can't happen unless you're physically present. So there are trade-offs here. And you always have to be looking at what are the pros and what are the cons, depending on the sector, depending on the company, and depending on the objectives.
But if we look from a employee's perspective, I have been going back to this number so often for the past half year. But it's like we're seeing the highest inflation in almost 40 years, while wage increase has, is still pretty prominent across Arab states or Asia Pacific regions, of course OECD countries. But then the real wages has saw the first decline in 15 years. It's a fraction of a percentage point, but still. Actually, what we're getting is declining. Half a month ago, I was in San Francisco. I paid $20 for a sandwich. And of course, I moved back to China in 2015, and the sandwich cost used to be $7 or $8, but now $20. So definitely there is a burden here. But speak from Africa, are there anything different? Speak just from the employees or people, job seekers' perspective. Out of COVID, people are also seeking for flexibility, but also security, right?
Perhaps to answer that question, I'd like to sort of go through three mega trends that are going on in the continent, for those that are not familiar, perhaps. Yes. And let me start by saying that it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me in the panel. The first mega trend that I would like to mention is the fast pace of digital transformation. So I think the continent has started from a smaller base, but the uptake of digital technologies and mobile technologies has been unprecedented in the past 15 years. So you have about 80% of the population having a mobile phone, 40% of them are smartphones, and the mobile ecosystem is providing a large number of employment. Most of them are in the informal sector, in the distribution of mobile services. And that takes me to the second megatrend, which is something that I would like to focus on, which is the prevalence of the informal economy. So you have about 80% of all employment in the continent is informal. So unlike other regions where when one refers to the informal economy, it's referred to as something that happens on the ground or in the shadows, this is really, we're talking about the core, the center of African economies, right? And most of them are popular, the youth is attracting a lot of the informal economy. So we have the youngest population in the planet as well. About 70% of Africans are below 30 years of age. And most of them, lacking access to formal employment, are seeking opportunities in the informal sector. So when you bring all of this together, the fast digitalization, the prevalence of the informal economy and the prevalence of the youth, you start seeing these trends of the Uberization of work, right? Which in other places may be seen as growth in precarity of employment, but in the African continent, it may well be the opposite. It may well be providing opportunities to informal workers to actually increase their productivity and access larger markets, and therefore providing pathways to formalization. So when we look at these two things together, we are seeing trends of digital platforms actually providing pathways for the formalization of the very large informal economy.
But speaking of that, like digitalization and of course technological advancement are unstoppable right now. Speaking of digital platforms or even artificial intelligence, and of course AI has been offering like your clients the way to train employees. Will that be very attractive to employees or actually employers? So who are the, what really is the demand there for AI in a workplace? It's for management, or is that like a bonus for the employees to keep them stay?
When we talk of employees, according to Forbes, about a quarter of workers in the US do some sort of remote work. In the UK, according to the Office for National Statistics, about 16% are exclusively remote, and about 28% do hybrid or some sort of remote. So as a total population, we're still talking about essentially the minority. And when it comes to learning, what we're finding is that typically if you're higher skill, higher waged, this remote working, hybrid working is good for you. You typically can have lower travel costs or move to a neighborhood outside of a capital city or an expensive city and still enjoy the higher salaries and now greater work-life balance and also more leisure time. But for junior employees, those who are just becoming used to the workforce, there are quite a few significant negatives. And when you look at Gen X and Gen Z in particular, you got to remember most of them also went through a difficult COVID period experience at university, where they didn't really get to learn with fellow classmates. And most of those who've been to university, you'd remember, you learned quite a bit in the classroom, but you also learned a lot outside. And based on the queries that we get on Quench AI, where junior employees are asking, how do I handle a colleague who's just lost a cat? Or how do I interact with a new customer, new client at an event? Do I hug them or do I shake their hands? Things like that you wouldn't be asking 5 or 10 years ago, because most of the learning one gets when they're introduced to a new job or somewhere is social learning, tacit learning, it's behaviors and norms. And I worry that the junior workforce are struggling to a large extent. You are now not as able to learn in sort of informal settings, spontaneous learning. You have fewer check-ins with your manager, right? Because after the first time you try something in an office setting, they usually check in with you. Hey, how did that go? Was this okay or not? Culturally, a lot of cultural knowledge comes essentially in an informal setting. And even networking. You might be a junior person. It's hard to start at a new job, right? And you might just enjoy the fact if you happen to be female and you have a male manager, well, you might want to just network with a female manager at another team or other areas where junior members are missing. And of course, AI-based learning can help, but the formal training that you are condensed to just being able to rely on as a remote worker is by no means going to be able to be a substitute for the holistic experience you get in an office setting.
But I've been always curious about how AI has been applied or used in the work environment, and especially there has been an earlier survey said like a lot of companies are actually using AI in today's world, but a lot of the employees never know, during their work, there are AI technologies And you've also mentioned for Quinch AI, you guys are focusing more on human-generated content instead of generating content on AI itself. So would you mind to share a little bit more on that, and why is that?
There's two parts to this. The first is 80% of the workforce, according to Forbes again, are using GPT or a similar tool right now.
Yep.
But most large companies at the exec level, they don't yet have a policy on how should we deploy AI more generally. It's not dissimilar to the early days of the browser and the internet. Sun Microsystems famously banned browsers in the early days because they didn't know how they should interact with that, yet most of the employees started using it. So eventually they developed policies. The first point is that at the exec level, there's nervousness around having so many of your employees using Gen AI models that have been trained on the open web. Because you can have hallucinations, inaccuracies, and things like that, and you may not know what is actually accurate and what is not. Hence this growing number of lawsuits. So we think that Gen AI shouldn't be used to generate learning content. Gen AI should be used to help people find the most relevant human-generated content, to finding what is already created, but has got a stamp of approval from a human, an analyst, or a brand, and it help surface that.
So I'm going to come back to that for real quick, just in a little bit. But on that note, speaking of working from home or getting learning lessons while working from home and offered from the companies, you mentioned the banks examples or whatnot. But again, our technologies are actually making the world smaller or actually pushing people farther away. Just as Mr. O'Sullivan mentioned, for some companies, they might save cost even using remote working. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, you're saving costs. I think a recent study in the United States said about 20% of labor costs are saved for roughly 50% of companies that are using gig workers. So that's positive, saving costs. There's also assessments that say that you improve productivity, right, of workers. Now, the thing with productivity is it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, you're more productive because you're using more technology and fewer workers that are on site. On the other hand, you're not as productive because actually some workers are simply not as attentive, right? And so there's two studies on productivity that were done recently, namely with workers in Asia, in India, and in China, which were looking at, again, a 20% decline in productivity when they were working remote. So there's kind of different angles here. I think what we want to keep in mind is, there's this huge opportunity, but we have to be careful of the downsides of the gig economy. So I just want to, if you allow, highlight a couple of the risks, the big risks. One of the big risks is related to this, the protection of the worker. Traditionally workers, they have a number of hours that they work, which is a maximum number of hours. They have holidays, they have a right to collective bargaining, they have a whole series of things. They even have occupational security. And none of these things are present for the average gig worker. So countries now are kind of struggling to find this balance and say, well, we need to provide some rights to workers, because otherwise we're going back to the 18th century with the coal miners, right? So we have to find this balance. And what's interesting is the EU has provided a directive on this front to protect workers in the gig economy. However, this is related to a second risk, which is the tension between platforms that are providing gig workers and the regulators. So Uber has come out, right? I'm sure you're familiar, to say, if these directives from the EU are passed to protect workers, prices are going to go up for consumers by 40%. They're going to close half of the offices, and they're going to have fewer rights. So do you want better service for consumers, or do you want more rights for workers, right? These are the kinds of issues and trade-offs that are being handled. And in Saudi Arabia, there's already some really interesting directions, namely through the freelance platform, freelance.ae, which is led by Future Work, with which we have a working relationship. And they're moving forward and providing specific support, like subsidies for Uber drivers. They have a Hadaf, a program, and they have a series of programs in which they're looking to incrementally support workers without disrupting the whole investment of platforms. So that's it, striking that balance between the two.
Absolutely, I think policies like for benefits or even protections to the gig economy workers or whatnot. And of course, sometimes it's like how it can mold into the local cultures, flexibilities or not. As you have mentioned, I came from East Asia, with a very Asian background. I grew up in China, even though I moved to the States. But the thing is, for a lot of Chinese people, we still want that security, wanted to see the people, wanted in an office, in a cube sometimes, and feel that's being secured. But of course, there will be other people are looking for that flexibilities. But today's companies are also going global. So Maya, for employers, are there any challenges in terms to attract all those employees, or like how? With what? Like flexible hours? How to keep or find the talent people?
I think it's a great question, and one of the things as I'm listening to this conversation that I would like to maybe zoom out for everybody is we could talk about gig economy and everything that we're discussing here, but I think if we zoom out, I think what's really fascinating to see is there is a kind of an ideological war happening, right? So if you take 20, 30, 40 years ago, you've had governments and large companies, right, be it Aramco or GEs of the world, that were kind of producing a healthy middle class of those countries. These corporates that were funded by government. And so everything was centralized, right? And so now we're going into this world, everything from my website, my company, my me, my selfie, right? So we're going to that world of me. The younger generation, you like it or not, wants freedom. And so I think that's the part here to consider if you are in a government position or if you're a leader of the company, to say, okay, what is good for my economy? Which, by the way, I'm all about benevolent dictatorship, because I do believe that discipline actually creates execution, but that's maybe how I grew up. On the other hand, what I see is a lot of gig workers who feel entitled. I will put in the minimum to get the maximum, right? And in some cases, it's not like that, nor should be like that, right? So there is something great to be said about these large companies and kind of governments who've had direction. Look at success stories, Rwanda, Singapore, right? Those were all benevolent kind of, rulers. And I would say that kind of brings a society to certain fruition. I think what we're seeing in the West and other places in Africa and Middle East, where this rise of gig economy, without a particular direction, I think the workers lack skills. So for us right now, we seek for devs, and I go to Central Eastern Europe. I am half Bosnian, half Serbian originally. And so we go there because they're educated really well in math. They are applied devs in addition to mathematics, and they speak English. And so for us, we don't care if they're in Silicon Valley or, wherever they are, we will take the best. Because again, technology is not an edge anymore. What the edge is in the market is a product market fit, and then how you actually scale that technology, right? And how you put it into the hands of the user. So I think we don't care where they are as long as there is a quality production, because again, we work with either large asset managers where we sell our startups, or large companies, like I mentioned, where we sell our startups.
Yeah, absolutely. And for a lot of jobs cannot just really fill the way the remote work or from like technology or whatnot, or even including AI, because the data suggests even though in OECD countries, including the US, unemployment rate is still remaining under 5%, but still in the States, things are getting better, but 70% of the job openings, especially in the sales and wholesale industry, are remain unfilled. And a lot of things, for example, in San Francisco, I'm seeing a lot of shops close just because they cannot find enough retail stuff anyways. So we're running short on time, but it has been a great discussion with you guys. Speaking of the future of technology, it's definitely great shaping how we see works and how we work. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.